in the first chapter of 1 Thessalonians. And in the general section, verses 2 through 10 of that first chapter, you have the condition of the church there at Thessalonica, the character of it in verses 2 and 3, the election by the gospel in verses 4 and 5, and then in verses 6 through verse 10, you have its reputation. They did have a good reputation. We're in verse 9 when we ended last time. When it says, "For they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how ye turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." So the people of Macedonia and Achaia were voluntarily reporting the success. Thus, Paul had no reason to speak anything regarding it. Others also declared the situation as to Paul's reception and the Thessalonians' obedience. Now in this, we start seeing and observing the power of the gospel. We mentioned, of course, we all remember Romans 1:16, the gospel is God's power to save. And James 1:21, it has the ability to save, but we also see in that ability, or it's able to save the soul, we also observe that it gives us the capability of laying apart all filthiness and superfluity or overflowing of naughtiness. Thus, the gospel has that power to save our souls, but also to change our lives. Now, these Thessalonians turned to God from idolatry, and now then they serve the living and true God. Turned is a word, it's used a few other places in the Bible. For example, in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 16, when he mentions, nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. That is a turning from that Old Testament and that lack of understanding and knowledge of the old that came through the Old Testament, and they turned to the Lord. That veil that covered their understanding would be taken away. But it was a turning to the Lord that brought that about. In Galatians 4 and verse 9, he mentions, "But now, after that ye have known God, or are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage." The bondage, of course, is the bondage of sin and wickedness. And specifically with the Galatians, because of the Judaizing teachers, they're going back to that law of Moses, which they could not keep and no one else could. But they were turning from the Lord to go back into that law of Moses. Here, the weak and beggarly elements. So they turned from God to that. In Matthew 18 and verse 3, it talks about, "Except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." Idea of converted, again, gives us that aspect of turning to God, become as little children, to enter into the kingdom of God. This, of course, is one of those passages which refutes the false doctrine of total hereditary depravity. If a baby is born totally wicked and sinful and evil, then you have to become wicked, sinful, and evil to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, no, it would not be totally contrary to everything that the Bible teaches. That's why that's false doctrine. If someone is born, when we were born, we were totally sinful, evil, wicked, and Jesus is saying, except you be converted and become as that doesn't make sense. You're right. But if you understand that babies are born sinless, then it makes perfect sense. Be converted and become sinless. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Catholics came up with the Immaculate Conception. So others came up with, well, because there was no male that was involved in the birth process or the conception of Jesus, and that sinful nature goes through the male lust. And they're all right, I guess. They don't have that nature, and that it's inherited through the man. Well, that's... I've always wondered with that inherited sin, if you have two righteous people, then why wouldn't the child be righteous? Well, Adam and Eve, they admit they were created sinless. But then they would argue, when Adam and Eve sinned, it changed their nature. Well, you're saying in relationship to the women. You're just fraught with difficulties. And when you get a hold of a false doctrine and then you try and defend it, you end up messing other things up. That's really what you got there. But turned also, if you remember those Greek verbs that I gave you and all of that, it's active voice. Now, active voice is the subject is doing the action. If you remember, passive voice is something is doing the action to the subject. Now then, this is action, active voice. Now then, why is that important? Well, it's important when you come to the doctrine of Calvinism, because Calvinism teaches that when a baby is born, he's totally depraved and evil. He cannot do anything that would please God because he's totally evil. So God has to act upon him he does so by sending the Spirit into him, and the Spirit then will convince him of his sin, convert him, and then preserve him to the end. But did you catch that? God has to do something to the individual. Now then, what do we have here? You have just the opposite. They are the ones who took the action. If Calvinism wanted to, they wouldn't want to use this verse, but if for their understanding of this verse, it would need to be in the passive voice, not the active voice. That God is doing something to them. So that would, Yeah. That's Calvinism. God's already predetermined to save him. Why does God need to do anything? Why didn't he just save him, at birth or at conception? Because he's already going to be saved. And so why was he born sinful? You see, Calvinism really doesn't make sense. He was born innocent. He turns, does evil, commits sin. He then has to turn from that sinfulness to God. That's what you see here in this verse. Ye turned to God. You're the ones who did it. God didn't force you to do it. God didn't do it on your behalf. You're the ones who turned to God. And it was from idols, so there's your sin and their wickedness. They had turned from idols to serve the living God. And then if you still have that Greek tense out, it's the aorist tense here. Ye turned. Aorist tense is a completed action, sometimes described as point action, but it deals with a completed action. There's an aspect of initial salvation. They turned, they made that decision. When? When they were saved, when they obeyed the gospel. That's when they turned, completed action to God. Now then, that doesn't speak in relationship to continued action, because when we get to the aspect to serve, that's continuous action. They made the choice back here when? When they obeyed the gospel. What did it do? It brought them to continued service. Continue to serve the true and living God. Thus, we also find out that turning by itself is not sufficient. If I were to give you, I'll just use Dot and Elward's house. I'm going to give you directions to Dot and Elward's house. You go down on Softly Field Road and you finally make a left-hand turn. Then a little bit later you make a right-hand turn. Then a little bit later you make another right-hand turn. And that one kind of goes around before you make a left-hand turn. And then after a little ways you'll be at their house on the right-hand side. How many of you, if you don't know how to get there, would be able to find that from those directions? I've told you you had to turn, and which way to turn even. Oh, no, where to turn. Turning by itself is not sufficient. For example, I told you the turns, and even which way to turn, but not where to turn in giving those directions. There has to be a proper turning to. And thus what we see here, turned to God. A lot of people can turn from evil, but they don't necessarily turn to God. How many people get caught? See this with kids a lot. They're going out and they do something and they get caught. And then they get punished and they're sorry then. Are they sorry they did it? Well, not really. They're sorry that they got caught and got punished, and they might even not do it again because not because it's wrong necessarily, but because they don't want to get punished again. It's possible to turn and never turn to God. In fact, people turn from God to sin and wickedness on a regular basis, don't they? People want to stop living the type of lifestyle that they're living. They turn from that lifestyle, but that doesn't mean they've turned to God. And so just turning is by itself is not sufficient. You have to turn to God. That's the proper turning. In this case, it is also turning from idols to God. Now, as Paul writes this letter to the Thessalonians, he's writing primarily to Gentile Christians. So they literally had been idolaters prior to the time that they obeyed the gospel. So to say they turned from idols is a very literal aspect. That is exactly what they turned from. They left their idolatry when they came to God. But that also gets us another aspect. We leave sin when we come to God. Doesn't mean, of course, that we never commit an isolated act of sin, but we leave sin. We try not to sin. We try to live separate and above it. And when we fail, when we fall back into it, we repent. God will forgive us. But we try not to sin. That's what the Christian does within his life. Bible knowledge commentary. And this to me sounds so odd, because I know who the writers of the Bible knowledge commentary are. It comes from Dallas Theological Seminary, or as I would rather say, cemetery, which is a Baptist theological seminary. Baptist or Calvinist. But notice what they say about this, because it's right on as far as what they say. And they say, someone has observed that humans have the freedom to choose who their master will be, but they do not have the freedom to choose no master. Notice the words choose, yet Calvinism, which they are, rejects the idea of the ability to choose. But yet they can't help themselves. But they're right about this. You have the right to choose who your master is going to be, but you're going to have a master. You're either going to be a servant or slave to sin, or you're going to be a slave to Christ. You can choose to be a slave to Christ. If you're not a slave to Christ, servant of Christ, you're going to be a slave of sin and Satan. But you don't have ability to choose, I'm not going to be a slave to anyone. Well, you are. There's no way you can help but be a servant or a slave to one or the other. But you have the right to choose which one it is. And this is the purpose or the result of turning to God, is to serve Him. We turn to God to serve God. David Lipscomb in his commentary stated, to serve God is a comprehensive expression including the various thoughts, feelings, and acts whereby a godly person seeks to please God. Now, he's right. It encompasses all of those, our thoughts, our feelings, our acts, whereby the Christian tries to serve God, to please Him, to do what He wants us to do as we make the choices in our life, each and every day of our life. The Christian tries to make that choice. This will please God, so this is what I'll do. That's service to God. And as we mentioned a few minutes ago, serve is present tense, a continuous action. It's not just a momentary whim. Have you ever seen individuals who they want to be baptized because they have learned at least that much, their need to be baptized, but they have no intention, no desire to worship God regularly, be at all of the services. They have no desire to live for Christ, bring their thoughts and their emotions, their wills, their actions in harmony with God's Word. But yet they want to be baptized because they think that baptism just gets them to heaven. And I've refused to baptize certain individuals because of that. Knew that they had absolutely no intention of living for Christ or doing what Christ wanted, but they wanted me to baptize them. Some look at it as the last step. That's right, though. It's the first step of your Christian life. And that should be understood within the context that I'm stating that. You're becoming a Christian by that step. One who has not been baptized properly is not a Christian yet. So that's the first step of the rest of your life, though, of Christianity. A lot of people think of it as, that's it. I've been baptized, I can sit back and do nothing now. It's just beginning. The word serve here is the Greek word, the noun form would be douloo, and it literally means to be a slave, or to serve, the verbal aspect, to serve as a slave. If you go back to the very first verse, he mentions Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus and to the church of the Thessalonians, which is in God the Father, and now notice this term, Lord Jesus Christ. The idea of Lord there indicates He is the ruler, He's the master, and we are His slaves. So the idea of slavery here, even though translated serve by, or bondservants, I think some use, is a very accurate aspect of Christianity. Then God is said to be living and true. The living and true God. This is, I think, within the context here, set in opposition to idols. Idols are dead, lifeless. And if you go back to Isaiah, he talks about these idols. They have eyes, but they can't see. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have mouths, but they can't talk, and so forth. Okay. That didn't fit in the figure I was using, but yes, he goes on, you cut down a tree out here, with half of it you make food or keep your house warm, and the other half you make an idol, to show the silliness of idolatry. But his point was they were dead idols, as opposed to the living God. God is living, not dead. And you could extend that out a little bit in our understanding in relationship to living. He has always been living. There is no beginning, no ending with God. That is the aspect of his eternality. He's not limited by time as we are limited. Things that are in our future, well, he's not limited by that because there is no future. Things that are in our past, he's not limited by that because he's outside of time. He created time. How could he be restricted by time if he created it? Now then, if you ask me if I understand that, no, I don't. I know the truthfulness of it, even though I cannot comprehend that in the least. And I would say, if anyone got up here and said, I understand that totally, I comprehend the aspect of God's timelessness, I would be ready to call him a liar. Because we're limited by time. Everything is according to time, according to man. And God doesn't have that limitation. So future, past, doesn't mean anything with God. That's, when you go back to the names of God, most use Jehovah or Yahweh. It basically deals with existing one. If you were trying to define the word itself, existing one, that he is the existing one. He just exists. Always have, although that's time-based, isn't it? Always will be, but that's time-based. See, that's why I say, for us to understand that, no, I don't understand it. But the knowledge of it helps me understand some things. I'll just give one illustration of this. Because I can produce certain show books that indicate this same thing. But in talking to a preacher in Chattanooga, Tennessee years ago, he made the comment that if God prophesied something, then God was duty-bound to bring it to pass. Basically eliminating the freedom of choice of the individual. I asked specifically about Cyrus the Great. Isaiah, 150 years before Cyrus was born, prophesied that Cyrus, and he uses his name, would be the one who would release the children of Israel to return to Jerusalem. And I asked him, did Cyrus have any choice in the matter? And the answer was no. Well, he had worked out if God prophesies it, it's got to come to pass, doesn't it? So God brings that to pass and eliminates freedom of choice of the individual. Problem with that, and I didn't get to finish up this because there were a bunch of other preachers and they rudely interrupted my train of thought. What about Judas? Old Testament prophesies of Judas. And that Judas would go to his own place, which was eternal torment. Did Judas have any choice in the matter? Absolutely. How can God prophesy about it then and not be responsible for it? That's the real question. And the answer, in reality, is God's outside of time. those things that are yet in our future. When Isaiah wrote that in Isaiah 44 and 45 about Cyrus, those things were yet in Isaiah's future, 150 years later. Wasn't in God's future. God could see the choices that Cyrus makes and then write about it as far as time is concerned long before it happened. But it wasn't long before it happened as far as God was concerned, because God was there. He's outside of time. He can see what's in the future. And so he knows what takes place. That's the answer with Judas as well, because that has presented great problems to people. Here's Judas. God sees the choices that he makes and that he betrays Christ. And he can write about it centuries before it happens as far as man is concerned in time, because there is no time with God. No, not God can time travel, because then you're limiting it to time again. He's outside of time. Time doesn't exist with God. It is all as if it is at the... And that's why I started to say at the same time, but there you go again. It's hard for us to comprehend. He's outside of time, though. If a crude illustration, I say it's a crude illustration. Think of the front of this whole thing here. Can y'all see all of that at the same time? That entire board from there to there, can you see all of it at the same time? What if you're right here and this person here can't see down here? Because he's limited to right here. God's outside of it and can see the whole thing. Whereas man is coming along in time. And I say that's a crude illustration, but hopefully it kind of gets us thinking in the right way of being a living God. He lives. Always has, always will. But he lives outside of our time. Now then, he uses our time, and he understands our time, and can tell us when something's going to take place in time, but he's not limited by it. So he is a living God. Right, he created time. What existed before he created time, though? Well, what we generally refer to as eternity. There's going to be there's going to be a time in which time does not exist anymore. What's that going to be? Eternity. God is in eternity, while man is in that period of time and limited by time. But there's going to come a day in which that time ceases to exist, and all men, as well as God, go into eternity. Time shall be no more. I believe it's Revelation 13 and verse 8. Yeah. Yeah. Someone can check that passage for me. I believe that's right. Revelation 13:8. That's right. Okay. And time shall be no more. So you have time sandwiched between two eternities, with God being outside of it at the time. So he is the living God. But he's also the true God. Thayer defines this Greek word that's translated true here as that which has not only the name and semblance, but the real nature corresponding to the name, in every respect corresponding to the idea signified by the name, real and true, genuine. And then he uses an application opposite to what is fictitious, counterfeit, imagery, or imaginary, simulated, or pretended. So you have something real, genuine, as opposed to something that's counterfeit. God is the true God. Why is lying so sinful? Yeah, why is it? No, not wine. Why is lying so sinful? It is deceiving someone, but look at God. God is a true God. It goes against his nature, and thus it becomes sinful. God does not lie. God is a God of truth. Whatever he says, because his nature is that of truth, genuine, that which is, then all that he's going to say is true. And if we're going to be in harmony with his will, then the lying, well, where does lies have their origin? John 8 and verse 44. You are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a liar from the beginning, and is the father of it. Satan is the father of lies, because God is truth. Satan is a liar. All lies are from Satan and find their origin in Satan. That's why Christians are always expected to tell the truth and not to lie. So, God's nature is that of being true, as opposed to the false gods of idols. They tell lies, or lies come from them by the very nature. They claim that they're a god, yet they're dead, lifeless, and lying about being a god. There's only one true and living God, and that is Yahweh. In verse 10 then, he says, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come. This is a continuation of their turning from idols to God to serve the true and living God and to wait. Part of Christian life is that of waiting. Waiting for the revelation of Christ. Waiting for his Son. And the idea of wait, again, is a present tense. You keep on waiting. How long? Well, no one knows, do they? Including all of those that say he is coming soon, or give a specific date that they continually have to revise because they mess up on. I think of this one guy camping who gave one date, it passed. So, well, I made a mistake on my figures, it's this date. And then he made another mistake because it didn't, have Jehovah's Witnesses who did the same thing. And so they finally worked it out, though. It was a secret coming. And Jesus came secretly in 1914. Well, I guess that way they avoided the problems, but then I still remember when they selected 1975 Christ was going to come. And I still wish that I had asked my boss, you turn everything that you own over to me at that, put it January 1st, 1976, and everything that you own belongs now to me. Yeah, why not? But they won't do it, will they? Well, some did sell all their goods and would go to mountaintops because they had been deceived into thinking they knew when. Carl, you... Revelation 10:6. Okay, well, it'll be time no more. Yeah, just what I said, Revelation 10:6. Mm-hmm. But this is a continuing to wait for the Lord's return. Notice, turn back over to Titus, the 2nd chapter, and we won't end with that. We'll wait until next week and start on that.